This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, partial license plates, manner of death, and the Peter Principle. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode 99 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality crime-related fiction. And this week, I'm answering your questions about running partial license plates, and then also manner of death, cause of death, and mechanism of death, and using the Peter Principle in your character creation. First, I need to thank Gold Shield patrons Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com, CC Jameson from CCJameson.com, Larry Keaton, Vicky Tharp of VickyTharp.com, Chris Ann, Larry Darter, Natalie Borelli, Craig Kingsman of CraigKingsman.com, Lynn Vitale, Marco Carocari of MarcoCarocari.com, Terry Swan, and Rob Kearns of KnightsFallPress.com for their support, along with my Silver Cufflink and Coffee Club patrons. You can find links to all of the patrons supporting this episode in the show notes at writersdetective.com/99. And to learn more about using Patreon to grow your author business or to support this podcast for as little as $2 a month, check out writersdetective.com/Patreon. Patreon. 99 episodes, which means episode 100 is next week. And I plan to record it with your help on Monday, October 26th, between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, which means 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. on the East Coast in the United States or in Toronto, Canada. It'll be 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. in London, England, midnight to 3 a.m. on October 27th in Berlin, Copenhagen, and Stockholm. 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. on the 27th in Japan, at least Tokyo anyway, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. on the 27th in Sydney, Australia, and noon to 3 p.m. on the 27th in Auckland, New Zealand. Why the global time zone rundown? Because the Writers Detective Bureau is global. After the U.S., top downloads come from UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand, and Japan. And then in the last few weeks, the Bureau has started ranking in the top 50 in true crime for iTunes in Mexico and India. So if you're in Oaxaca, Mexico, it'll be 5 to 8 p.m. and 4:30 to 7:30 a.m. on the 27th if you're in Mumbai, India. A half-hour time difference.
How'd you do that? It's actually, I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
So for episode 100, I will be doing a Facebook Live inside the Writers Detective Q&A Facebook group, where I will take your questions, answer them live, and then use that live recording to create the 100th episode. I will also be doing merch giveaways of Writers Detective coffee mugs, t-shirts, and hoodies. And obviously, international shipping is included for those winners. So come join me on Monday, October 26th, unless you're on the other side of the international dateline. Just hit rewind if you need to hear those times again. And if you are not a member of the Writers Detective Q&A Facebook group, which is different than the Writers Detective Facebook page, because Zuck can't keep anything simple, can he? So if you're not a member of the group, join us by going to writersdetectivebureau.com/Facebook, and that will take you right to the sign-up page for the group. It's free. You just need to answer a few quick questions so I know that you're you and not a spam bot. So anyway, as we approach episode 100, I just want to take a moment to say danke, tak, arigato, gracias, shukriya, shukran, merci, toda, spasibo, obrigado, grazie, she, and thank you for listening. But enough about episode 100. Let's knock out episode 99 right now. This week's first question comes right from Nupur Tustin in the aforementioned Facebook group. Nupur writes, keyword, information from a partial license number. How long would it take to get information about car registration, the owner, etc., if you had a partial license number and the make and model of the car? How would an LE go about this process? This is in Massachusetts, by the way. And how long would this take? Thanks in advance for any information anyone here can provide. Seems like a pretty straightforward question, right, Nupur? The reason I wanted to answer this on the podcast is that even in this prologue to a cyberpunk era we are living in, our motor vehicle database is still based on 1980s computer databases that can't run partial license plates. In fact, most states don't even tell you the color of the car. Make and model? How about a make and generic description of the model, like 4-door or utility? It's literally coded as like 4DR or UT. So if I run a Toyota, it's going to say Toyota UT. It's not going to tell me that it's a Highlander or a 4Runner. It's just going to say utility. For me to do a partial license plate search through the DMV, so that would be the California Department of Motor Vehicles. I know you're writing about Massachusetts, but it's going to be very similar. I have to call their headquarters in Sacramento for California DMV. Hope I get a civil servant willing enough to provide real help. This is the DMV after all. And pray that I get a result. Oh, and I have to know the secret numerical code the DMV expects me to give to make the request. That way they know that I'm really allowed to receive that info. And of course, having been a detective way back in the early days when you had to call the DMV to get them to snail mail you a color picture of a driver's license because they couldn't even email them to you, or heaven forbid have a website capable of giving you driver's license pictures. And yes, by way back, I'm talking about 2002. See, all those 1990 cop shows with their whiz-bang technology showed you lies. I tell you, lies. Anyway, back then you needed the correct code for the DMV to get driver's license photos, which, as the old guy, I still have. But if your protagonist is a younger detective, factor in not having the secret password into your time delays as well. Now, all that said, there is one workaround that you've probably heard of, but it still might surprise you. That workaround is Carfax. Ever wonder how Carfax knows so much about the used car you're thinking about buying? Well, Carfax proactively goes out contacting police departments around the country and makes them a pretty sweet deal. Carfax has a special website for law enforcement that will allow us to search Carfax for vehicles by partial plate, which, as I just said, our DMV computer cannot do. And they will let us refine that search by make, model, and sometimes color. Color isn't recorded by many DMVs, but some of the car dealerships will note it when they're doing work orders that Carfax ends up getting notified of. Carfax does this all for free for law enforcement, but they do it in exchange for traffic accident data generated by the police department or sheriff or highway patrol or whatever. The police department will scrub out any personal data or location data, but they will provide Carfax with the date and time of the accident and the extent of any noted damage from that report. And these reports are then pushed to Carfax either monthly or quarterly. So it's a win-win for both the Carfax and the police agency. Carfax gets really timely crash data that they can then use to flag potential vehicles that are going to be sold. And then the police agency gets the ability to not only search by partial plate, but also refine the search based off of make and model, potentially color, and even something as simple as I run a registration and it tells me that Toyota UT, I can then plug the VIN, which I will have if I run the license plate. I will get the VIN number. I can plug that into Carfax, and it will tell me that it is, in fact, a 4Runner. So if your protagonist has a login to Carfax, she can run the partial plate, get a result that shows the make, model, possibly a color of the vehicle, basically the whole Carfax report. And then the most important part, she will get the vehicle's VIN, the vehicle identification number. She'd then take that VIN that she got from Carfax and run it in the DMV system, which would give her the full license plate, as well as reveal the name and address of the registered and legal owner. So the registered owner being the person that owns it, right? And then the legal owner would be whoever the vehicle purchase was financed through. So to accomplish this, depending on how many hits I got for the partial plate, I can have the RO, the registered owner, identified in a matter of minutes. So it's author's choice on this one as to how quickly or how stalled out you want it to take for your story. So I hope this helps, and thanks for the question, Nupur. Diana Sharples sent in the next question. You can find her work at dianalsharples.com and on Amazon. Diana writes, "Thank you so much for any help you can give me with this question and for the time and expertise you dedicate to helping authors get it right." You're very welcome, Diana. Thank you. I write contemporary young adult fiction and young adult mystery. In my work in progress, my protagonist is trying to figure out exactly how his sister died 4 years earlier. She died in a car accident where she received severe head injuries and then went into a river, ultimately drowning. Police ruled the death as accidental, and the case was closed. However, some people who knew her started a rumor that her death was a suicide. Police also investigated this at the time and didn't find the rumor credible. However, my protagonist has some doubts. As he starts asking questions, he receives a text from a number he doesn't recognize saying, quote, "Stop what you're doing. People could get hurt," end quote. He takes this as a threat and wants to show the text to the police. My question is, how would the police respond to the text? Would they also see it as a threat? Given the circumstances, would they look at the old accident case again? Great questions, Diana. We have a few things to address here. The first is the death of the sister, and the second is the threat to your protagonist. So let's start with the latter first. How the police respond to the threat is really dependent on how your protagonist feels about it. Does he really think his life is in danger? For the police to really do anything about it, your protagonist, so in this case, the victim of the threatening message, needs to think the threat is credible. The wording of the text in itself does not necessarily imply that he is the one that's going to get hurt, nor does it specify how they'd get hurt. It might be enough of a threat for the police to look into who sent the message by getting a search warrant for the subscriber info of the number that sent the text, but it isn't nearly enough to get an arrest warrant for criminal threats once they find out who owns that phone. And to even go looking for the subscriber info would really hinge on how seriously the protagonist is taking the threat. The police will, by the way, want to know what he is, quote unquote, doing that could cause someone to get hurt. I know it seems like I'm splitting hairs here, but let's talk about how that message is actually rather vague. I'd argue that it could equally be interpreted logically in a way where it isn't a warning of impending doom. What if the mother of your protagonist received a sizable life insurance payout as a result of the death of her daughter? If your protagonist goes digging around and discovers the sister really did commit suicide, that could be enough for the life insurance company to come after the money they paid the mom, as the policy doesn't cover suicide. Seen from this perspective, isn't it logical that rather this being a threat to the protagonist, it's actually a plea for him to not do the hurting? When a message can be seen as anything other than an overt threat of injury, it becomes a bit of a challenge to investigate. Now, back to the death of the sister. This is a good time to touch on the differences between cause of death, mechanism of death, and manner of death. All three must be determined in a death investigation. In this case, Diana, I doubt the police would go back looking into it again, as technically it would be a third look into her death, unless there was some significant evidence that it was a suicide. So, barring some really big piece of evidence that points towards suicide, no, I don't see the police investigating whether her death was a suicide again. If it were possibly a homicide, that would be a different story. But whether it was an accident or a suicide, there still isn't a crime there. So I don't really see the police looking much further into it. Ruling the death an accident or suicide is actually done by the medical examiner or coroner, or an attending physician if the decedent was under their immediate care, like a hospice patient. Anyway, in this case, let's say the medical examiner ruled it an accident. That ruling is the manner of death. The manner of death can be accidental, natural, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. Accidental is when the injury that caused the death was unintentional, obviously, but it also means that there is no evidence to the contrary, meaning there's no evidence that there was any intent to harm or kill the person. Natural would be like the hospice patient, where the death is from illness, disease, or aging. As a kid, I remember hearing that people died of old age. It sounded terrifying, but knowing what I know now, I can only hope that's how I get to go. Suicide is obviously when the death is the result of the decedent's own intentional, self-inflicted actions where they intended to kill him or herself. Homicide is when death is caused by another person. And it's worth noting that homicide as a manner of death does not necessarily mean a criminal act. All murders are homicide, but not all homicides are murders. Murder's just a subset of homicide. Homicide can also include manslaughter, vehicular manslaughter, and justifiable homicide. Remember that homicide simply means that the killing was the result of another human being's actions. Undetermined deaths usually mean you had inadequate information about the circumstances of the death to properly determine the manner of death, or there may be competing manners of death and it isn't known which one is the factual cause because there's no overt or more obvious cause than the other. So real quick, to wrap up this discussion about cause, mechanism, and manner of death, now that we've covered manner, it's worth briefly explaining that the cause of death is the specific injury, illness, or disease that resulted in death, like gunshot wound to the chest with perforation of heart and lungs. Cause of death is the reason someone died. And finally, mechanism of death is what happened to the decedent's body physiologically. So in the case of a gunshot wound where the victim bled out, it would be listed as exsanguination. The mechanism of death is usually the most specific way to categorize how someone dies, as it's the specific physiological change in the body that resulted in death. So in your story, Diana, the mechanism of death for the sister might be intracranial hemorrhage or asphyxia or hypoxia. The cause of death might be blunt force trauma to the head or drowning. And the manner of death might be accident or suicide. So I hope this helps, and thank you so much for sending in your question. And lastly, well, this isn't a question per se, but it's something I was contemplating this week as both an active law enforcement officer and someone who's interested in storytelling. And that is how you can use the Peter Principle to flesh out your characters and how they interact with one another. If you haven't heard the term the Peter Principle, it's a management concept developed by Lawrence J. Peter. The Peter Principle says that if you perform well in your job, you will likely be promoted to the next level in your organization's hierarchy until you reach the point that you no longer perform well. So in other words, you promote to your level of incompetence. I'm sure most of you listening to this have worked for someone that was incompetent. And let me tell you, the Peter Principle is alive and well in most police agencies around the country. Obviously, not everyone at every level is incompetent. Some may be great at their jobs and intentionally avoid promotion to incompetence. Others may have self-awareness that they are incompetent in their current job and actively seek to rectify it. But the vast majority of those that are promoted to their incompetence tend to double down on whatever it was they think made them successful when they were one rung lower on the totem pole, even though their roles and their duties have changed. Having become a frontline supervisor when they used to be a tactician or operator, or maybe they were a great frontline supervisor, but they're having a hard time adjusting to being a middle manager. So rather than reuse the angry captain that yells at his detectives trope, and I'm looking at you, Lethal Weapon 2, think about which of your characters fits the Peter Principle bill as a realistic way to craft and describe some of the working relationships your protagonist either interacts with for his or her boss or partners or subordinates. For example, if you watch the show Bosch on Amazon Prime, you know that Bosch is a hard-driving, up all hours to work a case homicide detective. He is all about chasing murderers. And Bosch works for Lieutenant Grace Billets. We love Billets for her ability to smooth things over when tensions flare in the office, to be an understanding ear and confidant when a detective is struggling with something. And she does her best to buffer her troops from whatever shit starts rolling downhill from the command staff back at PAB. Now imagine what would happen if Bosch was promoted and took over Lieutenant Billets' spot as the commanding officer of the Hollywood Homicide Table. Bosch was arguably the best at being a homicide detective. But how's he going to be as a manager? He's not much of a people person. He's no longer the one out chasing the bad guys. Or is he? Is he going to insist that everyone works for him needs to have the same level of dedication and sleepless nights? If you know Bosch, you know he's going to be a slave driver and a micromanager as a boss. And if he gives me that judgmental head wag one more time, I'm going to put in for a transfer. In fact, he'd probably be just like Al Pacino's character in the movie Heat, Detective Lieutenant Vincent Hanna, a detective lieutenant that should be a manager of a unit, but instead he insists on running the big investigation rather than letting his troops run it, only to have it end in shootouts in downtown LA that result in several of his detectives being shot. And you thought Jennifer Aniston was a horrible boss? It was probably the 5th time watching Heat that I put myself in the shoes of one of Hannah's detectives, which coincidentally was while I was working for a micromanaging detective sergeant. And that was when I realized what a crappy boss Hannah was in Heat. Sure, he is the hero of the movie, but not to the young detective that got shot in the subway station, or to Buffalo Bill's now widow. So if you're trying to create a realistic work environment for your detectives, throw in a boss, or heck, even a detective, that's incompetent in their current position and see what ensues. Thank you so much for listening this week. This show is powered by your questions. Send them to me by going to writersdetective.com/podcast if you'd like it featured in episode 100. Or better yet, join me in the Writers Detective Q&A Facebook group on Monday, October 26th, or 27th, depending on whether you're on a far eastern continent, as I record episode 100 live and do a bunch of giveaways. Thanks again for listening and helping me get to 100 episodes. Have a great week, keep wearing those masks, and write well.